All right, we're going to move on now with our first keynote speaker. And you know, I said that this morning is all about skill building and this afternoon is about inspiration, but you were so fortunate because you get a double dose in Sally Glick with our opening speaker today, because she is both inspirational and she's going to talk to you about communication, and she's just going to share so much on skill building that you're just going to be wowed. Those of you in the business community, you probably don't even need an introduction to Sally, but I'm going to give you one anyway. Last year, Sally was inducted into the New Jersey Business Hall of Fame, which is hosted by Junior Achievement. Catherine Malone, the CEO, is here. Catherine, where are you? Give a wave. There she is. Okay. So New Jersey Business Hall of Fame inducted Sally last year as one of its laureates. Also, last year, NJBIA recognized Sally with a Lifetime Achievement Award. But even better than all of those, sorry, Catherine, last year at this event, we gave our first Inspiration Award, and Sally was our inaugural recipient of that, so well deserved. And that is because of her leadership, innovation, philanthropy, and dedication to the advancement of others, which she does every day and tirelessly. She's a principal with the firm of Sobel and Company, where in her role as Chief Growth Strategist, she develops and implements her firm's branding, marketing, and communications. Her keynote today is titled Communications and Leadership Styles, the Gender Impact at Work. I've heard this presentation and it is outstanding. I'm so looking forward to hearing it again. She's going to share her insights on how gender differences affect communication styles and, more importantly, how it impacts your success in the workplace. Afterwards, Sally will be happy to take your questions during a 10-minute Q&A. Please, let's give a warm welcome to Sally Glick.
So first of all, thank you, Michelle and Melanie, my friends here at NJBIA, and all the people that I've been working with for a couple of months. It is an absolute thrill to stand up here and have the chance. In fact, it's more thrilling for me to have the chance to talk than it's going to be for you listening, but I got the better spot. So let's start. Does anyone here, even for 1 minute, doubt that gender differences in communication and leadership styles have a strong impact on the way that women succeed and men in the workplace, whether in the corporate world or in the nonprofit community? Now, I know most of you have heard this old refrain before, but today we're going to talk about how to change that tune. Even if you have heard it all before, we'll start with a few observations that remind us of the significant role that gender communication styles play in our daily professional lives. Here's number one. The McKinsey & Company report for Lean In their 2016 Women in the Workplace study concluded that women are less likely to receive that first critical promotion to manager. So far fewer end up on the path to leadership, and they are less likely to be hired into more senior positions. As importantly, they get less access to the people, the input, and the opportunities that accelerate careers. Number two, high-paying job listings are written to attract men, writes Emily Peck, referencing a Huffington Post article regarding a data analysis conducted by a startup company called Textio. It is not super surprising that the listings skew more male when you look at the composition of the executive teams, says the co-founder and CEO of that company, Kieran Snyder. The majority are male executives who are probably driving the job requirements for those roles and are using characteristic male-centric language. How subtle is that? Number three, a headline in Top News for March 2017 published by Law 360 reads, while more and more female attorneys are shattering the glass ceiling and securing leadership posts in multi-district litigation, the high-stakes, high-paying world of those MDLs is still largely male-dominated, with only 16.5% of lead attorney roles going to women over the past 5 years. And lastly, in April 2017, a report issued by the National Partnership for Women and Families breaks down the wage gap in each state. But regardless of individual state details, the report notes that women face a wage gap in every single state, and that overall women employed full-time year-round in the United States are paid 80 cents for every dollar based on the man's salary, which results in a median income annual gap of over $10,000. Now, that leadership gap and the resulting pay gap identified in these studies that I've just cited is not a woman's issue. We all know that gender diversity is both an ethical and a business imperative for all of us. Equity is essential. So how did we end up in this situation in the first place? The answer to this complicated and complex question goes back in time. Research has been conducted over many years by gender specialists that indicates over and over again that essential behavior lessons are learned at a very young age on the schoolyard, and often in preschool. 3-year-olds are observed with this behavior, evolving and becoming deeply embedded as adult behavior and attitudes that emerge years later in the workplace. Simply put, researchers have observed firsthand that starting in preschool, young girls play differently than young boys. One of the distinctions is that girls are encouraged to be comfortable in a flat environment, one where there are few winners and losers, but rather where the emphasis is on one-on-one interaction with the intention of building camaraderie and gaining consensus. Now, you may not always see yourself in these exact words, but these are common observations. And you may very well remember your own childhood and say, that's right, that's how it was. Young boys, on the other hand, play more often in a hierarchical world that focuses on sports, including winning and losing and taking risks. Now, this may seem like nothing more than normal child's play and not very dangerous or frightening, but there's a rapidly growing consensus that suggests that as adults, taking risks is key to being recognized as an influencer. As such, we can conclude that what we think of as innocent playground activities can have a serious and potentially negative consequence in the work environment, because current data indicates that those who have been encouraged to take risks early on will likely be recognized later for their leadership skills much more than those who avoid risk-taking. So keep that in mind when we're talking about disadvantages or advantages that come out from childhood activities. As a nonprofit organization, Girls Leadership, along with Carol Dweck, the author of Mindset, reminds us that boys are praised for their efforts more often than not and are emboldened to take risks, while girls are praised for their talents, their good behavior, and they are urged often to adopt a risk-averse approach. So why does that pattern established early in our youth matter to us as adults? Well, it matters because of the very real ramifications of those patterns that grow even stronger as we grow older. During Women's Entrepreneurship Week in 2015, Susan Cole, president of our own Montclair State University, shared some alarming statistics that reflect the effect of those different communication and leadership styles on college testing. Young men entering MSU as freshmen all tend to score higher than their female counterparts in areas that include self-confidence, negotiation skills, risk-taking, and other categories similar to that. But that's not where the distinction ends. Debbie Walsh, who serves as the executive director for Women in Politics at the Eagleton Institute at Rutgers University, says that the disparity in test results widens through the next 4 years, so that when graduating seniors are tested, the male graduates continue to outpace the females on average in the soft skills area. Now, no one is suggesting, of course, that there's any difference in intellectual capabilities between the genders, but rather what they are saying is that young men test better because they show more confidence, and that self-assurance has a major impact throughout their adult years, specifically as they journey along their career path. Just picture a scenario for a moment with 2 college students who have recently graduated from law school, one male, one female. They're applying for their first job. Based on some of these observable behavioral patterns that we've discussed, who do you think is most likely to have the confidence to negotiate a better starting salary? The New Jersey Women Lawyers Association did a study and takes the guesswork out of answering that question. So it's not a trick question and you don't have to answer, but the results reinforce reality. They track the career trajectory of male attorneys versus female attorneys, beginning with that first salary negotiation through several years in the profession. Overall, female attorneys in New Jersey earn 77% of the salary that male attorneys draw, and it begins right with that earliest salary expectation and the negotiations or lack of negotiations for higher pay. They do not start or end on a level playing field because the young male graduate almost always asks for a higher salary than the young female graduate does. That pay divide grows exponentially over the years, and today there's a 44% difference in pay between men and women in the legal profession in the United States, according to the New York Times article written in October of 2016. So if we acknowledge that the genders start out differently, playing at school at 3, adhering to diverse communication and leadership styles that take root growing from childhood to adulthood, what can we do to ensure that this difference in styles doesn't result in unequal opportunities in the workplace? Grammarians recognize gender-specific speech differences, and their studies repeatedly indicate that male speech patterns are typically seen as forceful, efficient, and authoritative. Everything you'd want in a leader and a good communicator. While women's speech patterns are often viewed as polite, hesitant, and sometimes even apologetic. Think of that one-on-one situation, the importance of building collegiality and consensus, and why the two styles would play out the way they do. But this can have some sobering implications, as was pointed out in a study done by the linguist Robin Lakoff, which showed that both female and male members of an audience pay more attention to male speakers than to female speakers. Think about that. Audience members, when tested, recalled more information from presentations given by males than those given by females, and it occurred when the male and female speakers made identical presentations. But there is a solution. I believe that the first step to closing that communication, leadership, career advancement, and salary gap is to be aware, to be sensitive, to be educated about the differences in gender styles. We should all focus on conducting respectful conversations that help us develop the trust and confidence in each other, while also being open to new ideas and especially to new approaches, even when they make us feel a little uncomfortable. And that means we need to set a goal of eliminating stereotypes and overcoming prejudices. Now, sadly, just when we thought we had come so far, Abigail Beale published a statement in 2016 saying this: in the last 30 years, women's participation in the workforce, in athletics, and in professional education has increased in the United States. We just heard that women in the Fortune 500 women leaders increased by 50%. But gender stereotypes are just as strong today as they were 3 decades ago. Psychologists in New Jersey compared attitudes towards gender stereotypes from 200 college students in 1983 and again in 2014, and they found that nothing had changed over time. So we have our work cut out for us, but we can do it. Through training, we can build awareness that difference is just that, difference. The second step is to understand that we all have our own unique and distinctive communication skills and styles, sometimes based on gender, but also on cultural, generational, and even birth order influences. Without surrendering our personal brand and our core values, we do need to be aware of our verbal messaging and equally of our nonverbal cues. How we communicate is judged as a key indicator of how we inspire and motivate others. So both men and women need to embrace the suggestions that can help them be more effective communicators and leaders. I think author Jim Butcher summed this conundrum up very well when he wrote this. He said, I read an article once that when women have a conversation, they're actually communicating on 5 levels simultaneously. They follow the conversation they're actually having. They follow the conversation that is being avoided. They follow the tone that's being applied to the overt conversation, the buried conversation that's being covered up by subtext, and finally, they actually read the other person's body language. He then goes on to say, this is on many levels astounding to me. I mean, really, it's like being a freaking superhero. When I and most other people with that Y chromosome have a conversation, we're having a conversation, singular. We are paying attention to what's being said, we're considering it, and we're replying to it. So if men are communicating on 1 level, and women are communicating on 5, as he poses, what do we need to do to communicate with each other more effectively? Let's think about it. How can we leverage those contrasting characteristics of men versus women so that we all flourish? If we acknowledge that men are better at focusing on power, while women are better at focusing on relationships, that men are better at focusing on facts, while women are better at focusing on feelings, that men are more formal when communicating, while women speak in a more animated and informal fashion, when we acknowledge that men are better at interpreting verbal cues while women are better at reading body language, if we acknowledge that men are better at competing while women are better at focusing on building harmony, and men are better at being assertive, including the use of interrupting, while women are better at being more cooperative and collaborative, then, if we can agree on those distinctions, we can find opportunities to use the best talents of each while reducing the conflict between individuals. The fact is, men and women are excellent at drawing on different communication and leadership traits. They just apply them in different ways. We can balance the scales by being aware of the characteristics that appear more often during male communications, as well as those that are more consistently identified as part of female speech patterns. In fact, if we examine the most frequently documented communication discrepancies between the genders, we can see the advantages they present. We can also be sensitive to the implications. Everyone can adapt, be flexible, and tweak their approach to be more successful, more productive, and more effective in their careers without compromising their own style and personality. So this all sounds good, but my time's not up, so you're going to get to hear me keep going. How do we make this happen? Well, I have some ideas for you. Let's decide to stop talking about these observations and trends and start finding a way to turn the tide. For starters, in June 2015, Amy White wrote in Talent Management that women prefer to let their work speak for itself, so they often end up as doers, doing the work, instead of strategists, who are often behind the scenes, which limits their credibility at times, and also because they do not ask for new opportunities, remember those two law school students, and are reluctant to take risks, and as such, they may pass up higher level jobs rather than take a chance on a change. To reinforce this lesson, sociologists Candace West and Donald Zimmerman analyzed conversations that found that males interrupt females much more often than they interrupt each other, and even more often than females interrupt anyone. The use of interrupting as a communication tactic may be an unconscious way of exercising power. Interrupting someone can be intimidating, forcing an action on the part of the person, particularly women who are already in mid-level jobs, and perhaps even holding them back from advancing up that corporate ladder. So what's the takeaway from this research? It's great to hear it, but what does it mean? It means that anyone who wants to advance must speak up, highlight their own efforts, their own successes, and dare to take a chance. So let's spend a few minutes together looking at the top gender-specific speech patterns and attitudes and contemplate the potential impact that these are having in your business setting and what you can do about that. The first one is this: women commonly talk more than men. Now, in my office, they would say, yeah, especially if that's Sally. But as Psychology Today notes, while women speak about 250 words a minute on average, men clock in at around half that, 125 words. During the course of the day, women speak about 25,000 words, while men speak 12,000. What might the implications of that statistic be at work? Well, men might lose patience with women who they view as overly talkative, turning off what they judge to be chatter and diminishing the value of the discussion, and more importantly, missing some really critical information. Women can practice talking less and saying more. Number two, women, more than men, prefer to make eye contact and smile when communicating. So what would the implications of work be for that? Well, women are intuitive. We said that read body language. You can't read body language if you're not looking at someone, right? So those subtle clues get picked up by women, and they are good on teams more often than not than their male colleagues. Men don't pick up on those nonverbal cues as often. They sort of see them as less important. But looking at each other really matters. Picture kind of a sports bar, and everybody's watching the TV and talking to each other. never even looking at each other and what that feels like. But women sit and talk and look at each other all the time, right? Deloitte did the study that discovered these same statistics, and they started training their professionals that when you're in a room with a client, sit across the table, or if you're sitting next to someone and reviewing a document, turn your chair so you can look at the person. When you look at someone, particularly women, they feel more valuable, important, and like they're being heard. So the men need to think about that. Women need to recognize that you're making that judgment that someone not smiling at you may not be friendly, and that may not be the case at all. Women more than men nod their heads to show they are listening, while men nod their heads more often to show they agree. Just think of the implications of that at work. You could have a whole meeting, walk out thinking you have consensus, and only find out that everybody's saying, I heard you. And you're like signing everybody up, and they're like, I didn't agree to that. You did. I saw you nodding your head. So pay attention to that, recognize that, know that. Women interrupt less frequently than men. Statistics say much less frequently. What would the implications at work be? Well, when a man is interrupting, he may be seen as more intimidating. Women then fall unintentionally, perhaps, into a subservient role by having someone who's talking over them. They also do not have the chance to share their ideas fully if they're being interrupted. So they miss the chance to demonstrate their own capabilities, which we've already said leads to a cycle of not advancing. So consider that, and if you're a man about to interrupt, or even a woman about to interrupt someone, give them the chance to finish their sentence and have value and make an impression and give their contributions. Women ask for feedback and sometimes even permission more than men. We've talked about that flat environment. We've talked about the way you build consensus. How do you build consensus? By asking other people what they think. What would be the implications at work, possibly? Well, if you're asking for feedback, often than not, men might see that as a lack of confidence in your own opinions, a lack of decision-making skills. After all, why are you soliciting everyone else's opinions and building consensus when you probably have one of your own? It could be so easily misinterpreted as the lack of confidence in your own ideas. So think about that. When you're soliciting feedback, you can say, I have some great ideas of how we can move forward. I'd like to hear what everyone else thinks. Men can do the same. The next one, men are more concise and factual than women. I have a friend who's a woman, who is a CEO and was one of those Fortune 500, and I always say when she talks, it sounds like there's a balloon over her head with bullet points in it, because she sounds like a man. She's got her facts lined up, and she's concise. Men sound more organized in the workplace because of that. They sound often more professional, which then can lead someone to make a determination that they're more capable of offering solid solutions. They sound more effective at getting the attention of the audience because they are immediately offering essential information that doesn't get lost in the story. Women apologize more often and use the word just to qualify their statements more often than do men. What would be the implications at work for that? Well, if you're apologizing, you sound less self-assured, particularly to your male colleagues, and then you're also demonstrating that you have less authority. I'm sorry, I can't help you with that, or I'm sorry to interrupt you, whatever it may be. When you're sorry and you've done something that is worth an apology, you should say so. But if you've done nothing wrong, you don't need to say you're sorry. Otherwise, it does sometimes indicate that you are less competent or less self-assured. For example, just for a moment, hear the difference in these two sentences. I just want to make sure I know the time to arrive tomorrow, versus I want to check on the time to arrive tomorrow. Or I just have a few questions for you, versus I have a few questions for you. I have reread my email since someone pointed this out to me over the last year, and every email I send, I have to take just out at least twice before I hit go. And I know this. It's so easy. Just don't want to bother you, but I just want to ask one quick question. I have none of my male colleagues at Sobel & Company who ever say that, and they're better off for it. Men typically speak with a stronger, more assertive voice, wait till your father gets home, than women. What would be the implications at work, perhaps? Men sound more forceful. Think for a moment about that study that showed that everybody in the audience hears the men speaking and retains the information differently than from the same identical female speaker. So you're making an impression, you're showing your value, you're creating your credibility, and you're talking like this. Doesn't work. And lastly, men acknowledge their own accomplishments much more effectively than women do. This is a two-edged sword because we're very proud of the fact that we create teams and complement our teams, and we're very good at giving credit where credit is due. But there's a long continuum between taking no credit and taking all the credit. You have to be right in that middle spot. No one knows what you've achieved if you don't say so. Without tangible proof and without a willingness to put forth measures and data, you could so easily be overlooked. A New York Times article suggested in their coverage of these differences in the financial successes of female and male lawyers when they said men either are bringing in more of those big ticket cases or they're simply figured out a way to get credit for doing so. We can, and we have, talked about these challenges for decades. And yet, despite that, we struggle to find some reasonable solutions as we've seen unable to end the stalemate. As a result, gender inequality stubbornly persists in the modern workplace, often based on the very different communication and leadership styles exhibited by men and women, rather than on other key performance indicators such as competency, experience, knowledge, and skills. Tracing these differences back to our earliest childhood helps us understand why, and we even know what those differences are, but we're still kind of left with an unsatisfactory answer to the most important question: how? How do we change it? The fact is that men and women communicate differently. And although men and women speak the same language, they have very distinctive priorities, internal processing, and behavior patterns. And it's so all too easy to misunderstand or misrepresent the message or misinterpret the message. So to increase our ability to persuade, motivate, influence, and just get along, we must understand the gender communication rules, or the gender codes, for how men and women communicate. Both genders need to make significant changes. We need to put in the effort to take that leap from talking about the unfairness of it all, even if it's unfair, to working together to do something to close the gaps that our gender-centric communication styles and attitudes have perpetuated. We can address this challenge by building awareness at conferences like this, by being honest and transparent about the obstacles, by being more flexible, by acknowledging the differences in styles which each have distinctive benefits depending on the situation, and ultimately by concluding that there is no specific way that is best, but rather a blended approach that draws on the good communication characteristics and leadership traits from both genders. And that's what makes the most sense. We can urge sensitivity to each other's experiences and situations, as well as nurturing sincere mutual regard. This, in turn, will help us to build the rapport and honest relationships that increase productivity, profitability, and overall success in the work environment. It's hard to be uncomfortable and do things you're not used to doing. If you've done something from a very young age, it's really hard to wind that back, walk that back. But when you know that the rewards are there for you as men and women, it's win-win and no one loses in that sense. My goal is for there never to be, and 5 years from now there'll be no women's conferences. Not that this isn't fabulous. We won't need it. We'll just have conferences and everyone will be there. This is who said it best. Sheryl Sandberg wrote in Lean In, instead of ignoring our differences, we need to accept and transcend them. And that would be my message to us all. Thank you.
So you mentioned that the
Excuse me one second. You notice who had the courage and took the risk to stand up first?
So you mentioned early on that childhood development and behavioral patterns are learned even at 3 years old. So how do we really start addressing this in the education and school system? Do we even have to start telling teachers to say, hey, please don't say sorry for just asking a question? Even simple things like that. How do we start this?
Well, the point is we do start it, right? You've raised the perfect point, and that is that all of the adults who are in a position of influencing those children be aware, and that's why I said step one is just education. So what you might know intuitively needs to be part of the curriculum, and it needs to be part of the curriculum all the way up through 3, so that when you get to college and you take that test, talking about your soft skills and the development of them, that you're not being outranked by someone who's got more confidence taking that risk. So yes, you do need to reward that. There's certainly more young girls in sports today than ever, so this may change the cycle as we go, in that there's my granddaughters all play soccer just as much as my grandson does. Not quite as rough, I will admit, but they play. And I think that was also the different generations. I noticed that my friends who are millennials have more of an equal attitude toward each other and work as teams. And so some of those wonderful characteristics that I've said women have in terms of reading body language and being inclusive and building consensus, those are going to come to the forefront when more and more organizations create teams and build and work as teams. So those traits are going to be much more important than that authoritative leader perhaps who comes in and says, look, this is what we're going to do and here's why we're going to do it. That works sometimes, by the way, in certain circumstances. But I think some of these traits will, as generations change, become more important. But education's key. Parenting, school, everywhere that you go, if you're constantly reinforcing that behavior, and of course when children play with their peers who have older siblings, so I had a 2-year-old grandson and we were coloring and I gave him he said he had no crayons left and I handed him purple and he said, Baba, that's a girl color. He's 2. And I said, it's not, it's purple. It's not a girl color. Where would he hear that? Well, his best friend has a 6-year-old sister and she colors with pink and purple, so it's a girl color. You have to nip that as quickly as you can and say all the colors are good or whatever. It's hard. It's hard because it's just there. It's been there forever. But it can be done.
So if men and women communicate differently in the general sense, how, if you have a woman in her own outside of the general who happens to communicate more like a man, how do you overcome the expectation that she should be communicating more like a woman?
So that's a great question. I think that it's important, and as we go through, I thought you were going to go in a different direction. I thought you'd say, if a woman communicates like a man and has some of those wonderful behavioral patterns, how do you overcome the fact that she's a you-know-what, right? That's the question I usually get. So it's really important that you use common sense and that you draw on the skills that you have and that you recognize other people's feelings. So you can be smart, aggressive, forceful, and not obnoxious. Right? So you can be a great leader and still build consensus. You can say, this is the direction I think it's important for us to go in, but I also recognize I need to hear from everybody because you may have a different perspective. Let's talk it out. But you can take that ownership, you can take that control, you cannot necessarily behave like a man, but behave with confidence. So we need to get away from that. I may have reinforced that as I was speaking, but as I'm listening to myself even, it's not about I sound like a man or I sound like a woman, it's just how do I sound? And how can I use communication? It's not what I'm saying, but what you're hearing. And one of the things we can do is say to each other, tell me what you think I just said. I want to make sure that I communicated well and you heard my message. When that person repeats it, they may be saying something different, like the old game that we used to play at the parties where you said one thing and then the person repeated it and got all the way around. It was a totally different story. So you can, as a woman, be interested enough to say, and as men, be interested enough to say, this is what I intended, let's recap. And so you can be strong and assertive without being dominant and obnoxious. And you can praise your team and deflect some of the pride you have to them without detracting from yourself as well. This is my team. We've built this great team. I'm so proud of my team. You have a role in that. So I think it's when you abdicate the role completely that you get into real trouble. Did that help? One more.
Good morning, Sally. Nice to see you again this week.
Good to see you.
Sally, do you implement any kind of formal mentoring program in your organization to hopefully overcome some of the things that you've talked about and implement a more positive outlook or more positive implementation of some of the things you just spoke about?
So that's a wonderful point to raise, and yes, we do. We have 2 different kinds of mentoring in our firm. I think this is probably true across many of the companies, and that is, one is technical, so I'm not a CPA. I don't get to mentor anybody on how to do an audit or a tax return, but we also have a secondary level where we mentor in terms of soft skills. And sometimes a man is, obviously, many of our male professionals mentor women, and vice versa. I have a couple of young women that I mentor as well, and we just try very hard to recognize that those 2 things come together. If you've ever read Emotional Intelligence, you know that Dan Goleman talks about the fact that it's not your technical skills and your IQ that is going to be so important, but your emotional intelligence and the way you address soft skills and the confidence you show and the way that you communicate and lead. So it's really important that you have both sides, and we do that in our firm. And that goes back to that point about education. And by the way, if I have a minute to say this, we are mostly women in here, and I'm delighted that there are men here with us, but I speak, I have a monthly webinar that I do for CPAs, and they get CP credit for it, and it's on women's communication skills and men's communication skills. In order to get the credit, you have to sign in and you have to answer some poll questions, or they don't believe you're really on the call. The first question we ask each time is, are you a man or a woman? Just to get a sense of who's on the call. The topic is gender differences in communication styles and the impact at work. I've been doing that webinar now for about 4 years. 75% on the call once a month, every time without fail, are women. And 25% of the people on the call without fail, I think they read the title wrong, are men. And that's not anything about men and women. It's that we need to get that message so much more consistently, to your point, to everybody. And the more we pull away and have diversity councils and women's groups, the less likely it is for men to hear the message that we're all hearing all the time and that they don't get exposed to as frequently. So it boils down to doing that in your workplace and reinforcing it with your friends and colleagues. I hope that helped. Oh, sure.
So Sally, I
I'm
had
sorry.
a question, because you talked about law firms and where lawyers, women lawyers start off at a salary disadvantage. So where have you seen, I know we don't have legislation in place to prevent that, but where have you seen corporations or small businesses or businesses that have handled that, you know, especially when they start hiring? So when they have new hires, how do they try to equalize it? Because I think we have to look at that too, beyond the communication piece.
Oh, absolutely. And I don't actually have enough statistics. I'm not a gender expert. I certainly have studied this, and part of my career has been built on helping women in business. I don't have statistics elsewhere, but I know that at least in our firm, we try really hard to be as diverse as possible and to encourage all different types of people to apply for jobs. We have a lot of young women interns, young men interns, different cultures coming into the workplace, but you can only do so much. I think it goes back again to even in high school and college, when you're taking courses, when you're working with your counselors in how to negotiate. And I mean, I know that the lawyers go through a class on negotiations, right? Getting to Yes is a great book, so that you can learn how to speak up for yourself, but make the other person feel like they've perhaps either won or matched you. There are all different kinds of conflict resolution styles. That's a good class to take on how to get someone else to agree with you without feeling that they've been betrayed. And it's a skill set, you know, but it's hard to, and men are just so much more comfortable with that overall. I will say my children my daughter takes much greater risks than I do, so it's changing.
One last question.
Sure.
Hi, I probably like a lot of women here work in a male-dominated industry.
Is there anyone that isn't in a male-dominated industry? Okay.
So I'll walk into a room like this, and there'll be maybe 5–10% women, and the rest are men, and it'll be a cocktail party or something like that. And I wanted to know what was your advice for the best approach for me coming in by myself, you know, to approach, you know, the majority of the people at that
Sure.
party.
And frankly, even if they weren't all men, networking and, you know, everybody have that sweaty palm feeling when they walk in a room and they don't know anyone. The first thing I always say is it doesn't hurt to go to those kinds of programs with someone you know. I don't say you have to stick together and stand in a corner and talk to each other all the time, but if it gives you a little sustenance and fortifies you to know there's a friendly face in the room, there's nothing wrong with that. But when you walk in, particularly if you know the group, you know the kinds of things that are being talked about, remind yourself that everybody isn't best friends with each other. They're there for networking too. They are there to meet you as much as you are there to meet them. So you have to get that idea out of your head that everyone here is best friends and I'm the outsider. You're no more of an outsider than anyone else, and you have value to add. So that comes with that confidence code, right? That ability to say, they should be listening. Not I'm going to interrupt and barge right in and say, yeah, you know, can't believe the Yankees are losing now with it nearly being October. You don't have to butt in. If you stand and listen for a moment, all of us are pretty bright, and you hear a conversation going on, I'm almost 100% or 100% sure you would have something to add that would be relevant as long as you listen to that flow of conversation. So again, remember that it's always hard to interrupt or interact with people who seem to be all familiar with each other and you don't know anyone. But you can even say that. I came to this for the first time, I don't know anyone here. How many of you have been here before? Or what's a group like? Or is there any, you know, you can show your vulnerability, and I think that that also is sometimes endearing in terms of, well, how can we help this person? This is their first time here. And as long as you know the group you're going to and the kinds of things they focus on, and that's an area of your interest and expertise, you're in good company and you should be able to thrive.
Thank you.
It's scary. It's not only scary, it's subtle, and it's easy to fall into the trap. For this program, we have one of the panels I'm participating in later. Someone said, you have the panel questions, I need to review them. And I saw the email very late in the evening because I'd been out all day, and I immediately said, I'm so sorry. I didn't see this email. I will send you those questions as soon as I get back. And immediately, one of the panelists said, what are you sorry about? And I thought, really, if my managing partner got an email from someone saying, I need these questions, and he was away from his email and didn't see the exchange, he wouldn't say, I'm sorry. He'd say, I'll get those to you. I'm not in the office. My first thought was to say, I'm sorry. So don't think for a minute that this is easy to accomplish. The key is to be aware and then work really hard to adjust yourself to be your best, not necessarily a man communicating like a woman, but just be your best. Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much, Sally. That was great. Emphasizing your last comment, today we create some awareness around this. The first time I heard this presentation, I did sit there doing this, and it wasn't because I was just hearing her. I was agreeing because I was replaying in my own head how many of those things are so true and resonate in my own communication style and where that comes from. So now we have the awareness, and I challenge each and every one of us over the next few days, the next week, sit in the meetings and think about what she said in terms of those communications, and listen to yourself and hear yourself, and think about how you can get those justs out of there and put the apologies aside, and think about how you find in between closing that gap of the communication. And the other thing is so important about this event today, and why, Sally, I thought it was so important to talk about the men characteristics and the female characteristics, because we are a majority women in this room today. But as this day goes on, you'll see we have men participating on our panels, and our keynote this afternoon is a man. And the reason for all of that is we don't just do this in a silo. This is all about how we work together and bridge the gaps together. And you'll hear today throughout the day men talking about their role in bringing women up to the C-suite and the boardroom, and their recognition that they have an obligation to be a part of the discussion. And so we'd like to continue that provocative discussion of the fact that it takes men and women to make this happen. So keep that in mind as we go along today.